Let's travel back in time to the 1960s, when a group of English cities came together with a grand experiment in urban housing to solve their never-ending housing crisis. Although initially seen as a beacon of hope for residents, it swiftly became a haunting symbol of failure, one that would set back social housing for decades to come. So join us as we discover the rise and fall of the Yorkshire Development Group. Our story begins in the early 1960s in Sheffield and Leeds, two powerhouses of the Victorian Industrial Revolution. Both cities came into the second half of the 20th century bomb-damaged, with their inner cities dominated by back-to-back and Victorian terrace houses. These red brick dwellings with the bellowing chimneys and outhouses not only provided poor living conditions, but in the eyes of many were a throwback to a bygone era and deeply unfashionable in the forward-looking post-war era. Both Sheffield and Leeds had begun slum clearance programs in the 1930s, with some notable achievements, including Leeds' Quarry Hill Flats of 1938 and Sheffield's Park Hill Flats of 1961. Both trailblazers in high-rise council housing. Despite these efforts, demand for council housing was still high, with a need to speed up construction and bring down costs. Out of this, the Yorkshire Development Group was founded in 1962 by the housing and architectural departments of Hull, Sheffield and Leeds, and later by Nottingham. They sought to rationalise traditional housing design through the development of a range of fittings and building techniques similar to Khrushchevka's flats in the Soviet Union. And so was born Yorkshire Development Group Mark I Housing, led by a young architect, Martin Richardson, seeking to make his mark, following his successful work on council housing in Roehampton, London. The Yorkshire Development Group architects searched for an economic way to provide a good social grouping of dwellings to accommodate all demographics, avoiding the mixture of high-rise flats and low-rise dwellings or maisonettes typical of many council estates of the era. The problems of combining the various dwellings was solved by calculating the space required by each family. Each unit was then given the common width and height. Units of 1, 2 and 3 people could be accommodated on one floor. The larger units were more of a problem, but solved by splitting them between 2 floors. Whatever the size of homes, the cross walls would be 18 feet apart, but the depth could be varied in modules of 3 feet. The cost would be kept down by using a limited range of windows, partitions, and fittings within the cross walls. All service ducts and stairs inside the unit would be in standard positions, enabling dwellings to plug into one another so that they could be stacked to heights of 5 and 7 stories and arranged in many different ways. The flats could be placed side by side to form terraces, giving varied and socially integrated groupings. Wide continuous galleries or decks would provide access and serve as natural meeting places under cover. These decks could be linked by bridges, allowing the terraces to be assembled to suit the local landscape. The system was designed to be capable of being built by a variety of construction methods suited to firms already involved in their own forms of industrialized building. To make it economical, a large contract was offered to build nearly 4,000 homes in the 4 cities. All contractors experienced in industrial buildings were each to present their structural solution for the project and submit tenders for the first site. A precasting factory in York constructed a 2-story prototype on site, testing conditions and checking measurements. Water pipes in dwellings were standardized, and every detail, from the layout of cables to pipes, had to be planned in advance with no room for mistakes on site. The first site, a redevelopment area in Leeds West, was to be a series of villages made up of small courtyards. Broom Hall in Sheffield was planned to have an unusually high proportion of single-person dwellings, while Balloon Wood in Nottingham was planned as a group of open courtyards. In April 1967, the first wall panel was ready for erection. The concrete units had been in operation for some time, and despite not being undercover, production continued whatever the weather. Problems with the system-built design quickly emerged during the construction process. The building contractor Sheffield adopted a bonus system to encourage the speed of construction, with the aim of installing 25 concrete panels a day on each site. The panels made on site were used within 24 hours and not left to cure. Panels were often not installed correctly and damaged during installation, with missing corners and rubber seals. In Sheffield, tragedy struck when one panel fell from a crane, killing one workman, followed later by a floor slab collapsing and killing a further 3 workmen. The dangers involved in construction, especially at height, merely encouraged further poor workmanship, as workers didn't wish to expose themselves to further risks. Despite initial optimism, the resulting flats were poorly built with only a minimum level of insulation consisting of just half an inch of polystyrene to the middle of the panels. Some areas were uninsulated, especially around joints allowing for cold bridging. The flats proved very difficult to keep warm, with the concrete panels reacting poorly to short periods of heating. Following the Ronan Point disaster, the flats were heated by electric heating, which proved expensive, especially as the cost of electricity rapidly increased during the 1970s. Many residents were unable to afford heating, with some, by 1982, spending as much as £500 a winter to merely heat their flat. In Nottingham, the council found 83% of flats suffered from damp due to water penetration or condensation. Water entered through roofs, joints, walkways and balconies, ruining residents' carpets and furniture. Condensation caused black mold to build up on walls and ceilings, damaging wallpaper and creating an unhealthy living environment. Like many similar deck access schemes of the era, the high-rise decks encourage crime and anti-social behaviour. Lifts and stairways were poorly overlooked and proved difficult for councils to maintain. The social and damp problems associated with the flats created a high turnover of tenants, which resulted in an increase in problem tenants. In many cases, landscaping around the developments was poor, creating a bleak living environment. The bright modern flats with landscaped grounds envisaged by Martin Richardson had failed to materialise. The high dark courtyards created a harsh environment that failed to adapt to the different locations, especially in Nottingham, where such a high density seemed at odds with its suburban location. The Sheffield site was more successful, with the scale more suited to its city centre location and a concerted effort to provide good quality hard and soft landscaping. Due to the increasing issues with the defective flats, residents across all 4 cities formed the Yorkshire Development Tenant Action Group in the 1970s. There was an increasing realisation among the councils that the system-built dwellings were largely defective and that the manufacturing process, far from improving the standard of construction, had significantly reduced the build quality. As the 1970s wore on, the hope and optimism of the post-war period was fading. High-rise housing was increasingly out of fashion, and the brutalist exposed concrete appearance looked dated. By the early 1980s, the traditional industries of the north of England were in steep decline, and the demand for council housing was rapidly declining, with poor-quality, unpopular estates proving hard to let. Flatted schemes were increasingly hard to rent, with traditional houses preferred for families in light of the problems associated with high-rise living. All 4 cities were experiencing population decline and had a significant oversupply of council flats. Whilst the Tenant Action Group achieved a heating allowance and rate reductions, this didn't overcome the increasingly poor living conditions, which the residents could do little to overcome. In the early 1980s, Hull Council sought to radically remodel their flats, with one block remodelled in postmodern design with red brickwork, bright yellow windows, and a pitched roof. The connecting deck was removed. The resulting building, whilst a somewhat contrived design, rectified many of the issues associated with the original build. It also embraced the increasing rejection of modernist and brutalist architecture in Britain with the emergence of the postmodernist movement. However, the extent of works required to make the flats livable was clearly excessive, especially considering that council flats were in an oversupply. All four councils therefore sought to demolish the defective developments. Demolition at Leeds started in 1983, with Hull and Nottingham following. The flats had been lived in for only 15 years, and the demolitions marked the beginning of the demolition of many similar post-war council house schemes throughout Britain. The Sheffield site sat empty for a number of years, with the council unable to even afford the demolition costs. A stark reminder of the city's decline and the fading post-war optimism. The demolished sites were redeveloped in postmodern styles, using traditional building methods with an emphasis on more traditional two-story dwellings and smaller-scale blocks of flats, avoiding the large integrated decks, the only remnant of the Yorkshire development group being the one block reclad in the early 1980s by Hull Council that still stands today. For the lead architect Martin Richardson, by the 1970s he was working on housing schemes at a more human scale in the emerging new city of Milton Keynes, and would go on to be project leader for Piano and Roger's famous Pompidou Centre in Paris, as well as working on housing schemes in the Netherlands. However, he still felt personal remorse for the failure of the Yorkshire Development Group and the impact it had on those tenants who suffered.